And we're live. Yeah, man. I am back up in this thing, man. Apologize for missing y'all yesterday, but man, I'll tell you what, I was exhausted. It was a long day at work. And man, I just came home and crashed the hell out. I'm not gonna lie to you. But I'm feeling good right now, man. I was a little drowsy on the way home, a little drowsy. But I caught what I like to call the Toby two-piece. And the Toby two-piece, for those who do not know, two of my favorite Toby Keith songs, courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue and Made in America. Yeah, well, sometimes because the way the music thing works, the music app, sometimes they'll throw them back to back. And man, they get me fired the hell up. I'm sorry. If you don't get fired up from them songs, then, might need to check your pulse because you might be dead. But yeah, man, caught a Toby two-piece when I was about 15 minutes out. So now, I gotta wind myself down. So I put a little bit of oil in this here cup. I'm gonna have a few sips. Ah, there we go. And we're gonna talk about something that is rather poignant, I think. In today's episode, the supreme irony of 2020. And when we talk about that, right, 2020, first thing that comes to my mind is the old adage, right, the old apothegm, the old bromide. Hindsight is 2020. And that is, to me, the supreme irony. Because if you look at what's played out this year, and we'll go through some of the things, the common theme is if we had a little bit of hindsight. In other words, if we had a little bit of a perspective on history, if we had a little bit of a grasp on history, a lot of the things we're seeing play out in 2020 would not be so. It's almost, you can almost just grab at anything that's going on and you can find a historical correlation. For example, and this started a little bit before 2020. However, in 2020, there exists a party, an extension of the Democrat Party called the Progressives. Now, for those of you who are history scholars out there and, history buffs, you know that this is not the first time that there has existed such a party in American history. In fact, the Progressive Party in America was pretty big in the 20s, 30s, and onward. And back then, they were a group of leftists who espoused very dangerous ideology. Ideology that was very racist. Stop me when this sounds familiar. And a lot of their philosophies ultimately ended up laying the groundwork for eugenics, which is an under-discussed facet of American history. For those of you who are not familiar, the eugenics movement came about from a bunch of leftist, intellectuals who said, we need to basically stop stupid people. We need to stop undesirable people from reproducing. And they basically, through their own, thought clouds, through their own processes, identified groups of people that were seen as inferior and thusly should not be allowed to procreate because they would only add to the problem that already existed in their existence. So this led to sterilization. This actually became a thing where people were sterilized against their will. And that's actually, Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist. A lot of the who's who's of American histories, you'll be shocked to find out were eugenicists. But Margaret Sanger was one, the lady who created Planned Parenthood. And, it's no coincidence that blacks were seen as a group that should not procreate. Now, the majority, right? They used a bell curve type of a method because W.E.B. Du Bois was also a eugenicist. So, and the eugenicists are also, it depends on who you read, but there are a few historians out there that tag the eugenicists and eugenic sterilization as the forerunner of what would become the Holocaust. So this is all came from the Progressive Party. And then you look at the progressives in 2020, and what are they giving us? They're giving us critical race theory. They're giving us Black Lives Matter. So they're still espousing dangerous doctrines that can lay the groundwork for very, very terrible things to happen. So you think that's one? Okay. Well, what about the liberals and how their new favorite term for people like me, people who are basically they came up with a group word for everyone who's not white, and we are called POCs. For the uninitiated, that would be persons or person if it's singular, or if you identify as many people, whatever. Person or persons of color. Now that sounds an awful lot like what Jim Crow had for us in the South in the antebellum days when we were just called colored. Just another historical parallel that if we had a little bit of hindsight in 2020, then maybe we would know, wait a minute, there was a time when Democrats labeled non-white people as something. What was that? It was on signs. It was on water fountains. Colored. There it is. But they just decided to dress it up and say persons of color. And now we're supposed to, I guess that's fine because you don't hear a lot of people complaining about it, which is sad. So, okay. Those are two examples. Meh. Well, what about the fact that we now have Democrats that still argue for segregation? University of Michigan, Dearborn had some sort of student affairs kind of deal where they had students kind of talking about their experiences on campus and what it was like for them. Only problem with that, aside from a plethora of sophomoric imbeciles talking at the same time, aside from that, the only problem with that was they decided to separate it by race. And by separated by race, I mean white people in one meeting and everybody else in another. And you say, okay, that's one example. Well, how about that little summer fun camp, which we will talk more about later, the Chaz, where you had literal segregation. This garden, these shrubs placed in some dirt on top of cardboard are for POCs only. This section are for POCs only. So the left and Democrats are back to advocating for segregation. Again, something they did in the past. So now that we mentioned that nasty four-letter word, I would like to talk about a man, and I'm going to have to look his name up here because it's an Indian name, and let me take a little sip of all. That's some good stuff. We'll talk about this man. He's an Indian man. His name was Guru Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. You can just smell the curry, right? Well, this man was a cult leader, disgraced, and I believe he was excommunicated from his old country, India. So, of course, like most of the riffraff, he found a home in America. And what he did was organize a cult. Now, this cult took over land. They actually bought land, but then they ended up taking up more land in Oregon, in the Pacific Northwest. Okay. Now, stop me when this starts to sound familiar. So this man, he created this cult. It was basically a sex cult, but it was a little bit more than that, but that's basically what it's being called now. It was a little bit more than that, though. So they bought land in Oregon, some little small town in Oregon. This land cost millions of dollars. How did this man from India procure all this land? And it was, they built like a little commune there. Well, he was aided by wealthy liberal elites. So they helped this man establish a territory in the Northwest, which eventually they expanded and took over more of another small town. Let me just look that town up so I can be precise in what I'm saying here, because I don't want to keep alluding to a town here that I'm just not going to name. That is a little tacky. So we're going to type in Oregon sex cult. It's not very. Let's see here. How a tiny, overwhelmed Oregon. Yes. Campaign of terror. Yes. Let's go here. This looks like it's going to take me where I want to go. But anyway, so this man ends up coming to America, aided by wealthy elites, wealthy liberal elites. Antelope, Oregon. That's the town. Antelope, Oregon. So basically took over this town, and it was alarming, but they disarmed people because it wasn't like a hostile takeover. They just took over the space with dancing, singing, just general weird hippie kind of dippy behavior, and communal living. They basically established their own commune, and just kind of life was one big festival. Now stop me when this sounds familiar, because there was, I'll be damned, another takeover of the Pacific Northwest a few months back. You may have heard of it. It was called the Chaz. Then they changed it to the Chop, where a bunch of spoiled, wealthy elite children established an area, just took it over. Tried to establish communal living, didn't work out so well because, as it turns out, none of them have any survival skills. And there was daily dancing, singing, and also violence. But again, a little bit of hindsight. Maybe Jenny Durkin, the mayor there, does her job and says, wait, this didn't end well in the 80s. It probably won't end well now. Okay, well, let's move a little bit forward some more to something that is somewhat underreported, right? And that is the accretion of, you could call it political, but there are physical and political attacks against Jewish people in New York. So you had, I don't know if you're familiar with the knockout game, where you'll have these little punk kids run up and just sucker punch people, and like that's supposed to be like a game, right? Because these kids are punks. Which, come on. I mean, to digress for a second here, I don't understand. Okay, when I grew up, sucker punching was just that. You couldn't brag about sucker punching somebody. You want to fight somebody, you call him out, you shoot the fair one-on-one, and you take what you get. But this whole thing about, you see it all the time with these little punk-ass Antifa kids. You see it all the time with these little punk-ass Black Lives Matter kids. Hell, you know what? To be fair, I saw a video where a Trump supporter did it too, and I was a little upset at that. Where you have men just sucker punching people. That is just so, that's just gay. Don't do that. If you want to fight somebody, fight him like a man. Square up, call him out, no chicanery, and see who the better man is. That's how you do it. Okay, none of this pussy ass hit and run shit. Okay, rant over. So you did have I believe they're called Hasidic Jews in New York, that were victims of this, more so than anyone else, right? And I saw an article, I believe it was in the New York Post, that kind of highlighted it, but for the most part, nobody said anything about it. Well, then you look at how the Jews have been specifically targeted by Andrew Cuomo, the governor, in terms of his policies, to where when New York's first insane lockdown happened, he was basically threatening them and saying, "You can't go to synagogues, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't worship, you can't go to your parks, you can't go to your community events," but at the same time, turning a blind eye to Black Lives Matter. Not even turning a blind eye, just outwardly endorsing it. Well, New York's about to lock down again because, surprise, surprise. And Cuomo recently has been quoted as saying, targeting Jewish people specifically again, saying, you can't go to synagogue. And so he had made one comment where he was like, this kind of behavior, we need to stamp it out. It was very violent verbiage that he used. That, for whatever reason, is still kind of not being covered, which is interesting, right? So, but we've been down this road before, where political figures target a specific group of people, even Jewish people. We can even leave it there. We've been down this road before, where people then enacted violence against these people. The pogroms in Russia, that was state-sanctioned violence against Jewish people. Excuse me. So, again, maybe if we have a little hindsight, somebody speaks up and says, "Yeah, you know what? I know where this leads. And we probably should stop this now." Because number one, we don't want violence against anybody, any of our citizens. No one should be in fear of being sucker punched in the street. No one should be specifically decried and denounced for practicing their religion. But on top of that, we kind of have a blueprint with this specific group of people as to how bad things can get when we go down this road. And that brings me to the leftists in general, right? I try not to say liberal, right? Because there's still, I almost feel like, those cops that work in, the not so good parts of town. And they're like, no, there are still good people here. Yeah, there's gangbangers destroying the city, this and that, but there's still good people here. I kind of feel like that when I'm talking about liberals versus the left. Like, in that analogy, I guess the liberals would be the good people living in the hood, and the leftists would be the gangbangers and the people destroying it, right? So there's still good liberals. So I try not to throw them all in the same bag. We can talk as to the liberals in general. I think they're misguided on a lot of things because they tend to live in a world that is not grounded in reality. But they're a little too utopian. But again, good people, non-violent people, for the most part, right? You have exceptions on every side. So let's talk about the leftists then, because those, for all intents and purposes, are the primary perpetrators of violence in our society. So, now again, maybe hindsight's 2020, right? Maybe there's an example of an organization that was an extreme political faction that advocated violence, okay, used intimidation and, just big boy bully tactics to kind of get their message across, okay, that openly advocated for censorship, okay, and targeted people who they deemed to be nonconformist to their ways. Now, let me think. It's a little early, sun's coming up, so my brain gets a little hazy when the sun comes up, and I'm taking another sip of this oil while I'm trying to think of who this might be. Because what I just described to you is fascism. So I have to think of a major fascist organization. Nazis. There it is. I knew it would come to me once I took a sip of this here all. So you have these leftist types, these Antifa types, and here's some irony in and of itself, who are supposed to be anti-fascist, right? But they're literally using fascist tactics. Literally using fascist tactics. And when I say literally, unlike most Americans now, I actually mean literally. So let me do this. Let me look up the word fascist. So we have a working definition here. And today's word of the day is zinger, as dictionary.com continues to lose credibility. All right, let's see, fascism. Here we are. Okay. A governmental system led by a dictator having complete power, forcibly suppressing opposition and criticism, regimenting all industry, commerce, etc., and emphasizing an aggressive nationalism and often racism. So, I like this because you gotta kind of piece. This one doesn't fall into place so easily, right? Because that's the story, that's the rhetoric now that Donald Trump is a fascist, even though he is literally the exact opposite of that. But another episode maybe. So, a governmental system led by a dictator. Okay. Well, does a governmental system actually have to be government? Could a governmental system just be the executive committee of, let's say, I don't know, maybe Facebook, or maybe Twitter, or maybe YouTube? I don't know. Having complete power, forcibly suppressing opposition and criticism, regimenting all industry and commerce, etc. Not so much. Registering industry and commerce, but they do tell you what can and can't be said. Did they not say that for the election they'll be pulling anything that declares a winner? Is that not regimenting? And emphasizing an aggressive nationalism? Not so much nationalism, not with these people. And often racism. There it is. And in place of that nationalism, you could put critical race theory. You could put being woke. You could put any of the stuff that they espouse in place of nationalism in that definition. So we have these, just a handful. I just picked a handful of examples because, like I said, I want to keep these to about a half hour. You know, get you where you're going, play me in the background, listen to it. Maybe it sinks in, maybe it doesn't. Hey. But I just picked out a handful of examples of how we are literally reliving the past. Which brings me to one of my favorite quotes, a quote from George Santayana, which says, "Those who forget the past, those who forget history, are condemned to repeat it." And 2020, right? 2020, it seems like we have forgotten history, we've forgotten the mistakes we've made, and we are living through a year where we are remaking just about all of them. So hopefully, I don't know, maybe it makes you think, maybe we get this thing figured out, because where we're headed is not good. It is not good. And the only way it gets fixed is if we fix it. Hindsight is 2020. Not so much in 2020. Anyway, that's what I got for y'all today. A little bit of a somber note, but hey, go out there, have a wonderful day. Remember, I am always watching. That is a bit of a somber note, but hey, it is what it is, right? So go out there, have a wonderful day. Thanks for listening to this episode of Planet Hog. I will be back at you later on, probably around the same time tomorrow. So until then, your Supreme High Chancellor Hog is punching out.